I'm going to talk about optimizing multimodal adaptive interventions. But before I start, I wanted to thank my amazing collaborators. I also wanted to mention that all the examples that I'm going to show you today, they're based on work by my amazing colleague, Maureen Walton, and she's here. But I modified all the examples for illustrative purposes. So this is not how they're implemented in practice. And if you're interested in how they were implemented, Maureen is here, so she can tell you. Lucky me. Okay, so what is the gap that this work is trying to address? We know that with recent advances in digital technologies, such as EHRs, mobile devices, wearable sensors, we have so many opportunities to extend the reach and the impact of SUD and HIV services. Now, with digital technologies, we also have opportunities to collect rich and granular data about people's state and context, and we can use this data to adapt the delivery of support, to adapt the delivery of interventions to people's rapidly changing needs in the real world in real time. So there are many opportunities here, but I think that to fully take advantage of these opportunities, we have to figure out how to best integrate digital components with human delivered components. And the reason we have to think about this integration is because each modality brings its own advantages and disadvantages to the table. Okay, think about human delivered components such as coaching sessions. Okay, these can increase supportive accountability and therapeutic alliance, which can increase treatment engagement. And we know that treatment engagement is critical for treatment success. But what's the downside? The downside is that these components, human delivered components, tend to be relatively burdensome and relatively costly. Now think about digital components, such as a prompt from your mobile device encouraging you to take a walk, take a deep breath and count to 3, be mindful in the moment, right? These are relatively inexpensive, potentially less burdensome. But what's the downside? The downside is the suboptimal engagement of people in digital interventions and digital tools. You see across the board, different programs, different problems, different digital tools. We see people use the technology a few times and then they stop. They stop either immediately or gradually, but they do stop before they fully benefit from the intervention. So we have to figure out how to best integrate these two modalities so that people can benefit from both worlds. But the question is, how do we do that? You see, we don't really know how to best sequence and adapt human delivered and digital components together simultaneously. So what do we know? This is just an overview of my talk. I'm going to mention a few definitions, but I promise I'm going to repeat them. Okay, what do we know? We know that human delivered components can be adapted on a relatively slow time scale. What do I mean by adapt? By adapt, I mean the use of dynamic information about the person to decide whether and how to intervene. And that use of dynamic information has to be empirically based and it has to be protocolized so it can be replicated. Okay, that's what I mean by adaptive. By slow time scale, I mean every few weeks or every few months. And I understand that slow and fast is relative, but that's what I mean broadly, okay? Now, if you want to develop an intervention in which human delivered components are adapted on a slow time scale, it means that what you want to develop is what we call standard adaptive interventions or just adaptive interventions. Now, if you scientists, if you have questions about how to best construct an adaptive intervention, there are existing experimental approaches that you can use, such as the SMART, the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial. Now, what do we know about digital components? Digital components can be adapted on a much faster time scale, every few days, hours, minutes, seconds. Now, if you want to develop an intervention in which digital components are adapted on a fast time scale, typically it means that you want to develop what we call a just-in-time adaptive intervention, or a JEDI. Now, some people call it Jedi, but we call it JEDI because, for obvious reasons, we want the Force to be with us. But that's not the point. The point is that if you have scientific questions about how to best construct a JEDI, there are existing experimental approaches that you can use, such as the MRT, the micro-randomized trial. But what if you want to develop an intervention in which human-delivered and digital components are integrated and they are adapted on multiple timescales, both slow and fast? In other words, what do you do if you want to develop multimodal adaptive interventions? This is why we've been working to develop the hybrid experimental designs. So what I'm going to do in my part, I'm going to start by telling you more about adaptive interventions, just the background, and the SMARTs. Then I'll tell you about JEDIs and the MRTs. And then I'm going to show you how these concepts are connected to multimodal adaptive interventions and the hybrid experimental designs. I'll show you how hybrid designs can help you answer scientific questions about how to best construct multimodal adaptive interventions. Interventions in which human-delivered and digital components are integrated and adapted on multiple timescales, slow and fast. Okay, so that's the overview. Yeah.
So it says experimental design. So these are optimization designs.
These are all optimization. So Linda already said it. That's a really good point. These are all optimization trials. Okay? Their goal is to optimize an intervention, not to evaluate an intervention. If you want to evaluate these interventions, you can conduct a randomized controlled trial where you compare the intervention to a suitable control. Here, the assumption is that you don't know how to best put the components together to form an adaptive intervention or a JEDI or a multimodal adaptive intervention that is actually optimized, okay? That achieves intervention ease, as Linda defined. All right, so I think we're ready to start with adaptive interventions. I know I already said that, but let's repeat the definition. I guess the most important thing to know about an adaptive intervention is that it's not a randomized trial. There are no randomizations in an adaptive intervention. Many people find this confusing. The goal of an adaptive intervention is not to gather scientific information. The goal is to guide the delivery of interventions in practice. That's an intervention delivery framework. And specifically, adaptive interventions, they guide how practitioners should adapt interventions in practice, how they should use dynamic information about the person to decide whether and how to innovate. Now, the goal here is to be able to address not only the unique, but also the changing needs of people as they progress over time. And specifically, standard adaptive interventions, they're trying to adjust conditions that change relatively slowly over a few weeks or over a few months. That's why the adaptation happens on a relatively slow timescale. And these interventions, they typically guide the adaptation of human-delivered components. So here's an example. This is an intervention for youth who visit the emergency department. The goal is to reduce their substance use. It starts with relatively minimal support with a single session in the emergency department plus a digital intervention that delivers tailored messages on a daily basis. At week 4, they assess the participant status. If the participant self-reports to use drugs at week 4, they're classified as non-responders and they transition to the second phase where they receive remote health coaching. This is human-delivered coaching. Otherwise, they continue with the same initial intervention. 2 things to notice. 1, this intervention is adaptive because we use dynamic information about the person's response status to decide whether or not to add coaching. And the adaptation here happens on a slow time scale. Happens 4 weeks after emergency department visit. Why? Because the goal is to address conditions that change relatively slowly. The goal is to address early signs of non-response to the initial intervention, which unfold over 4 weeks. That's why we adapt at week 4. We adapt on a relatively slow time scale. Very nice, but in many cases, we investigators, we have questions about how to best construct standard adaptive interventions. For example, here, I don't know if it's beneficial to start with this minimal support, or maybe it would be more beneficial to bring in coaching right off the bat. Beneficial in terms of reducing the number of substance use days by week 16. I also don't know how to best address the needs of non-responders. The assumption here is that I should step up for non-responders, step up with coaching, but maybe it would be better to simply continue with the initial intervention. So I have 2 questions. How do I answer them? This is where the SMART can be useful. Again, SMART stands for Sequential Multiple Assignment Randomized Trial. The SMART is an experimental design. It's a randomized trial, but it's a special randomized trial because it includes sequential randomizations. What does it mean? Sequential randomizations, it means that the same person can get randomized multiple times in the course of the trial. In the SMART, every stage, each stage of randomizations corresponds to a point in time in the adaptive intervention that you're trying to develop, in which you have scientific questions about the selection and adaptation of intervention components. You see, if I want to answer the 2 questions that I showed you earlier, how to initiate this intervention and what to do at week 4 for non-responders, instead of starting with minimal support, because I don't know if I should, I randomize to the intervention with and without coaching. And then in week 4, because I don't know if I should step up or continue for non-responders, what do? I re-randomize my non-responders to step up or continue, and my responders continue with the same initial intervention. So notice I'm randomizing twice. Initially and at week 4. Why? Because I have scientific questions about what to do initially and what to do at week 4. I'm randomizing on a slow time scale. Initially, 4 weeks later. Because I have scientific questions about how to best construct an adaptive intervention in which the adaptation happens on a relatively slow time scale. You see, so there's a connection between the time scale of the adaptation and the intervention that you're trying to develop and the time scale of the randomizations that you will need in the trial design to help you answer questions about that intervention. Okay? All right, so now we're ready to talk about JEDIs, because a JEDI, just like an adaptive intervention, it's an intervention delivery framework that guides how we should adapt interventions in practice. But JEDIs are special because in JEDIs, the adaptation happens on a much faster time scale, every few days, hours, minutes, seconds. Why? Because we're trying to address conditions that change relatively fast. And you see, these conditions are not just changing fast, they're also changing in people's daily lives, outside of standard treatment settings. That's why JEDIs, they typically guide the adaptation of digital components, because with digital components, we can adapt rapidly and we can deliver interventions in the real world. As an example, I want you to think about the digital intervention that youth receive in the emergency department, okay, from the previous example. And suppose that as part of this intervention, digital intervention, every day we ask participants about their state and context using ecological momentary assessments. We ask them about their stress, their loneliness, their hopefulness, and we use GPS to monitor their location. Every day, if this combined information indicates that the person experiences high risk for next day substance use, we trigger a message with a protective behavioral strategy. Otherwise, we do nothing. So you see, there's an adaptation process here because we're using dynamic information about the person's risk status to decide whether or not to send a message. But now the adaptation process happens every day on a much faster timescale. Why? Because we're trying to address conditions that change fast. We're trying to address risk for next day substance use, which is expected to unfold on a daily basis. That's why we adapt on a daily basis. We adapt on a fast timescale. But again, in many cases, there are questions about how to best construct JEDIs. For example, here, I don't know if it's beneficial to trigger a message with a protective behavioral strategy. On average, in general, I don't know if it's indeed beneficial in terms of reducing next day substance use. I also don't know under what conditions a message would be most beneficial. See, here the assumption is that we should trigger a message when risk is high, but maybe we should trigger a message when risk is moderate to high. I don't know. How do I answer these questions? This is where the micro-randomized trial can be useful. The MRT, just like the SMART, is a randomized trial that includes sequential randomizations. But in the MRT, the sequential randomizations happen on a much faster timescale. Practically, what it means is that the same person can get randomized many, many times, hundreds or thousands of times in the course of the trial, and the length of the time interval between stages of randomizations is relatively short. For example, if I want to answer these two questions, what I can do is I can conduct a trial where every day I collect information about the person's state and context with EMAs and with sensors. But instead of triggering a message when risk is high, because I don't know if I should, I randomize to message versus no message. You see? So I'm randomizing on a much faster timescale compared to the SMART because I want to answer scientific questions about how to best construct a JEDI in which the adaptation happens on a fast timescale. All right, so now you know about adaptive interventions and JEDIs, and this is good because guess what? Investigators want to combine them. Here, what I want to do is I want to take this adaptive intervention that I showed you earlier, where the delivery of coaching at week 4 is adapted based on early signs of non-response. And at the same time, I want the digital intervention that youth receive in the emergency department, I wanted to adapt the delivery of the messages based on daily signs of risk. You see? So I want to create an intervention in which human-delivered components are adapted on a slow time scale, and digital components are adapted on a faster time scale. In other words, I want to develop a multimodal adaptive intervention. And you can think about it as an integration between a standard adaptive intervention and a JEDI. But again, I can tell you that we have many, many scientific questions about how to best construct multimodal adaptive interventions. And I want to share with you one question that I'm personally very interested in scientifically, okay? I want to know if there's a positive synergy between starting the intervention here with coaching and delivering a digital message. The reason I'm interested in the synergy is because I think that by starting with coaching as opposed to this minimal support can increase supportive accountability and therapeutic alliance, which will increase engagement with the messages. So starting with coaching will amplify the effectiveness of the message and reduce the next day substance use. That's what but how do I test this? This is why we've been working to develop the hybrid experimental designs. Hybrid experimental designs, just like SMARTs and MRTs, they include sequential randomizations. But here, participants get randomized to human-delivered and digital components on multiple time scales, slow and fast simultaneously. For example, if I want to answer the question about the synergy between the coaching and the digital messages, as well as other questions about how to develop this multimodal adaptive interventions, what I can do is I can take the SMART that I showed you earlier, where we first randomized to the intervention with or without coaching, and then in week 4, we randomize non-responders to step up or continue. And at the same time, every day, we collect data about the participants' state and context with EMAs and sensors, and we micro-randomize to the message versus no message. So I'm randomizing on 2 time scales. I promise I'll get to you. I see you have a question. I'm randomizing on 2 time scales, slow and fast, to human-delivered components on a slow time scale and to digital components on a fast time scale. I promise I'll open it up for questions. Data from this hybrid design, hybrid SMART MRT, can be used to answer many types of scientific questions about how to best construct multimodal adaptive interventions. This manuscript here provides a list of questions that you can answer. It also provides the way to analyze data from a hybrid design, hybrid SMART MRT, and how to plan sample size for this hybrid design. This manuscript here provides an introduction to 3 different types of hybrid designs that vary in terms of the scientific questions that you have. And this manuscript here provides an introduction to hybrid experimental designs and multimodal adaptive interventions specific to HIV researchers. And we also have online resources, code that you can use, you can download to analyze data from these trials and to plan sample size. So if you're interested, you can check it out.